Nwaneri has entered the transfer portal, and this is not how I wanted to start the transfer season. Let's talk about what it means for the Tigers right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets. If you win your first $5 bet, visit FanDuel.com to get started. And later on the program, I want to talk about another Big Ten team in a bowl with quarterbacks that are ducking Missouri, by golly. No, that's a bit of a joke, but I'm already anticipating some narratives coming our way for the Music City Bowl. But you know what? I got to start the program with some bad and frankly shocking news coming out of Columbia, as Nwaneri, according to multiple different sources here, is entering the transfer portal. Wow, this is a really big impact here. This is a guy who is obviously considered one of, if not the top players in the entire country, coming out of high school, coming out of Lee Summit North, by the way. A big to-do when he signed, hanging out with Armand Mimbouz, heading off to the NFL, and Caden Green as well when he decided to transfer from Oklahoma to Missouri. So the Tigers had really enjoyed some victories over Oklahoma on the recruiting trail, obviously. Well, we're going to have to reverse that one a little bit here. Or so it would seem, because you do have to remember, or is basically what I'm saying. Remember, just because you enter the transfer portal doesn't mean that you have to transfer. See Caleb Brown last season on the basketball side as a good example. Could Missouri still be in this thing? Because all indications are, well, this is a bit of a negotiating tactic here. So here's the thing. Could Missouri still win Nwaneri back? Well, technically that is true, but it sure doesn't seem like it at the moment. I'm not really holding my breath. I would think that if a bigger NIL offer, for example, were forthcoming for Nwaneri, I kind of doubt that he would have entered the transfer portal already. But that's just my instinct here. And adding to the confusion and the surprise is that this seems to have caught, well, a bunch of current Missouri Tigers off guard as well, including Luther Burden III and other players, based off of just their social media remarks and their direct comments to Nwaneri's announcement on Instagram, that type of thing. So I don't know about you. Here's what I can't wait for. Remember when Nwaneri had committed to Missouri, but then was wearing gloves of Oklahoma and Georgia and all that kind of good stuff? Man, I cannot wait to talk about Nwaneri's accessories in the offseason. He said incredibly sarcastically. Now, obviously, the other big news right now is that Miller Moss, the USC quarterback who entered the portal recently, well, he is reportedly on campus today at Missouri taking an official visit. Louisville is on his schedule as well, and you got to hope, if you're Missouri, that he doesn't even end up getting to Louisville. I think this is pretty clearly, no matter what you and I think of Miller Moss, more importantly, the coaching staff has made it pretty obvious that Moss is the number one priority here at the quarterback position. And because of that, well, especially where Missouri stands right now at the position, that's got to be considered your number one priority in general. But here's the thing. The Nwaneri news coming out of nowhere, seemingly, at least to this podcaster, I'll put it that way. I was certainly caught off guard by it. The deal is with Missouri, this can still be a fruitful portal season and probably ultimately will be. The disappointing part of this is probably Missouri's biggest and most impactful portal loss since probably, I would say, Dominic Lovett after he transferred to Georgia following the 2022 season. Prior to that, it was probably Mekhi Wingo, the defensive lineman who's now with the Detroit Lions of the NFL. But the deal is, for the most part, those guys that Missouri has really wanted to keep around and needed for especially that upcoming season, well, Missouri has kept them around. So I think a lot of people like myself were expecting a big leap forward possibly next season with Nwaneri. So whether that happens or not, we'll just have to see. But the bottom line is, I think it's very obvious that Nwaneri definitely got a big NIL package to play at Missouri this past season with little to no production to speak of. So it'll be interesting to see what exactly his market is the second time around here. Are the Georgias and Oklahomas going to be calling once again, or is it going to be a little bit different of a picture for Nwaneri? I imagine it's probably the former, but it is curious to me that Missouri, if they thought he was going to be a big impact player in 2025, it does strike me that they might have made a little bit more of an effort to keep him around. I do have to admit, after talking to Brian Smith this past offseason many times about Nwaneri and all the Missouri recruits, well, the Scoutmaster had me believing that Nwaneri was going to be an impact player this season. Called him a generational type prospect, but I think the emphasis that maybe I should have put on that statement, I heard the generational part. What I should have focused a bit more on, and this is my fault here, was the word prospect. Because Nwaneri, by all accounts, is relatively raw at football, doesn't have a ton of experience actually playing the sport. So his obvious potential is still very much there. Whether he gets there or not is definitely an open question. I'm definitely going to be curious, as I think all Missouri fans will be, at the very least, to follow Nwaneri's career here and see where it ultimately goes. But speaking of guys who I've been following for a long time, Alabama offensive lineman Miles McVay. He was an East St. Louis high school guy around the time when I was following Tyler Macon and Dominic Lovett, a couple other East St. Louis high products. Well, that was when I first got onto Miles McVay, who ended up, by the way, being one of my early Twitter followers in the podcast all these years ago. Well, I bring this up because it looks like there's a decent chance McVay could come back to Missouri. That's a real strong could at this point. But the young man who used to be a 4 or 5-star type of prospect, a really high, it's certainly a 4-star prospect, 6'6", 340 pounds. He's still got 3 years to play after not playing a ton with the Crimson Tide so far in his career. But Miles McVay, another interesting name to watch, and certainly with Armand Mimbu off to the NFL, a couple of other starters out of eligibility, well, Missouri's going to be looking hard at offensive linemen as well. So notice after a big-time Cotton Bowl victory last season, the narrative from anyone trying to talk Missouri down, of course, was that, well, Ohio State was down to its third-string quarterback. Of course, ignoring the fact that Missouri had injured with a brutal quarterback sack their second-string quarterback. So I feel like the Tiger defense deserves at least a little bit of credit there, don't you? But similarly, Iowa may be in a similar position coming up, but fortunately the Tigers have some excuses of their own. But you know what? Let's talk more about the Music City Bowl coming up here in just a second and what exactly it's going to mean for the Missouri program. But first, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And with the Iowa Hawkeyes' usual starter, Cade McNamara, off to the transfer portal once again. Its second-string quarterback has an injury problem. Well, now it's Jackie time. Yes, Jackson Stratton, their third string quarterback for Iowa, also their NFL bound starting running back, is not going to play in the game as well. So Iowa definitely, it had a challenged offense anyway. Let's put it that way. Not exactly the most thrilling offensive football, maybe the poster childs of what people don't like about Big Ten football is the Iowa Hawkeyes. So if you're Missouri, hey, maybe start licking your chops defensively. How about that? But certainly an Iowa team that can't be taken lightly, even with a third-string quarterback, because it's not as though lighting up the scoreboard is how they win football games. So expect a knockdown drag-out, quite possibly, in Nashville. And with all that said, and speaking of my friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook, the Tigers currently 3.5-point favorites over the Hawkeyes in Nashville. And I got to say, that's kind of surprisingly low to me after having laid out everything I just did with Iowa, of course. But Missouri naturally has some excuses of its own with Luther Burden III off to the NFL, Armand Mimbu as well. There'll probably be some other injury-related sit-outs from this game, but I'm not really expecting anybody else to opt out for NFL reasons or anything like that. That's just my anticipation at this point. But again, 3.5 points, there's no doubt that Brady Cook is going to play in this game, right? So with Iowa down to its third-string quarterback, its running back, its starting running back is out of this game, 3.5 just doesn't seem high enough. Now, of course, the college football playoff bracket has been revealed, and as I predicted, frankly, this offseason, I knew that people were going to get upset with the automatic teams that get the 4 byes into the playoff. Boise State and Arizona State, people just don't feel like those teams are worthy of a bye week. And frankly, I agree with that. I think both of those teams should be in the playoff bracket. I don't have a problem. Like, there's a lot of SEC fans, for instance, who are upset that the Southeastern Conference only got 3 teams to the Big Ten's 4, and we can argue, we can quibble about that, but the idea that the SEC needs to have 5, 6, 7 teams, even if truly in a Vegas power rankings or something like that, if those truly were the best 6 of 12 teams in the country, I still wouldn't be for that, even as a fan of the Missouri Tigers, who obviously are in the SEC. So at the risk of talking against my own self-interest here as a fan, I think some of these arguments ring a little bit hollow, because if you're the Southeastern Conference and you want all of the money that comes with adding Oklahoma and Texas and having these big-time matchups and having tougher, more difficult schedules that are appealing to television audiences and, of course, just as importantly, television executives and their stockholders and that type of deal, well, that's the cost. That's the cost of doing business, in my opinion. If you want all that, you don't get to have your cake and eat it too, which is something that the SEC and the Big Ten are very much trying to do at this point. To me, if you're going to have 16-team conferences, well, there's going to be a cost to that, because you're not going to have perfectly round, fair schedules or anything like that. And by the way, that happens in the NFL every season as well. And in fact, the NFL tries to do it that way. They try to give the crappy teams weaker schedules the next season, that type of deal. So to me, there is no perfect solution here unless we go back to 8-team conferences. When does anybody expect that to happen? So if you want perfect fairness, you want perfect champions, go back to the 8-team conferences. Go back to at least divisions where everybody plays each other. How about that? So to me, the SEC keeps trying to have its cake and eat it too. And listen, if Missouri's the 6th team in, I'll take it. But at a certain point, as somebody who used to be a Big 12 fan, by the way, who understands what it's like to be outside of this conference, I can understand why the rest of the nation can find Greg Sankey in the league that just means more to be a little obnoxious at times. For me, though, I definitely, back to the college football playoff and its format, What I would actually like to see, I'd like to see more home games. To me, the quarterfinal round, I would have be on campus as well, even if that means obviously some teams would host 2 playoff games in a row. I don't think those campuses are going to be complaining about that whatsoever. I just think having 3 straight rounds of the playoff being on a neutral field is maybe one round too many. I'd like to take more of a NFL approach to it where only the Super Bowl is on a neutral field. To me, semifinals, okay, I can get down with that notion, but quarterfinals being in neutral sites, the Peach Bowl, whatever, to me it just kind of loses a little bit of meaning and would be a lot more fun to watch on campus. That's just my humble opinion. That's the tweak that I would make. And yeah, I could say I definitely think the conference champion should automatically qualify for the field of 12, but should they necessarily get the top 4 byes? Now that's something I think is debatable. And in case you missed it, Dennis Gates highly encouraged the crowd to storm the court. He was thrilled with it, but maybe the athletic department less thrilled. I don't know. I think with a victory over Kansas, you can weather the $250,000 fine levied by the SEC against Mizzou. And since, by the way, this is Missouri's 3rd violation of access to competition area policy. How did you like that word salad? Let me give that one to you again. Man, I do love bureaucracy. Violation of access to competition area policy. In other words, storming the field and court. We could just call it that. Any subsequent offenses was actually going to double the fine for Missouri to $500,000. So a sternly worded letter and a bit of a fine for Missouri as well. But hey, $250,000, probably money well spent. That's going to probably be posters and videos and social media. Well, that was probably worth it. All of that exposure was probably worth the $250K right there, I have to admit. I do have to admit, I was encouraging the Missouri students with about a minute left. No, too early. I was doing that, but fortunately, it all worked out for the best. I do have to admit, when Dennis Gates called his surprise timeout there with 2 seconds left, there was that young man in the Michael Porter Jr. jersey who excitedly ran onto the court a little bit early, only to sheepishly run on back to the baseline. Good on the security and police department for not tackling that poor guy to the ground when probably they would have been legally within their rights to do so. But fortunately, the spirit of the law was adhered to and not necessarily the letter of it, at least for that young man who had to scatter back to the sideline. That was a pretty funny moment there at the end of the game, I thought. You know what? Coming up on the program, something that happened at the end of the SEC championship game, actually Carson Beck's injury for Georgia at the end of the half there, as well as Missouri's, well, pretty disgusting, honestly, Hail Mary attempt at the end of the half against Arkansas. It's got me rethinking strategy a little bit here. And you know I love talking strategy, so let's talk some more about that right after these quick words. So again, end of the half against Arkansas a couple of weeks ago now. Missouri, well, obviously looking, the clock management left a lot to be desired, number one, but let's leave that aside for the second and just talk about the end of the half Hail Mary situation. Brady Cook tries to buy some time, ends up, I believe, taking a sack. Regardless, I know he took a hit on the right sideline there at the end of the half on a play that, let's be real, when you're throwing a Hail Mary from the 50-yard line, what are your chances of actually scoring there? And in fact, at the end of the half, this is something that coaches, I think, are now taking for granted. You can lose the ball and the team can scoop and score it, that type of deal. There is an actual downside at the end of the half. And of course, as we saw with Carson Beck, it's not just about the game itself. You have an injury downside as well. I think all of a sudden, coaches have become so worried about, we got to get off that Hail Mary at the end of the half. They're now treating it as if they're down 5 points at the end of the game with a Hail Mary from midfield. That is a completely and utterly different scenario. Because in that scenario, remember what, hey, Jaden Daniels, now of the Washington Commanders of the LSU Tigers last year, well, this season in the NFL, he had an amazing Hail Mary where he ends up buying time for 8, 9, 10 seconds or something like that. And no doubt that's a big reason that play was successful. But at the end of the half, when these quarterbacks like Carson Beck are rolling around for 6, 7, 8 seconds doing everything they can to try to get this play off, well, Beck put himself in a really, really dangerous position there. And guess what happened? He ruined his elbow. I don't think he's coming back next year. It looked like, as was correctly pointed, as a good reference, I thought, by Kirk Herbstreit. He was saying, hey, that looked a lot like the Brock Purdy injury a couple of years ago when San Francisco was playing in the NFC title game. It was the same kind of action. As his arm was going forward, somebody basically grabbed it and just, in a very awkward fashion, just, basically tore his elbow up. So to me, that's something that coaches have really got to be a lot more conscious of. Not only because, yes, this isn't the last play of the game, desperation when you're trailing, then you obviously want to do everything you can to throw that baby up in the air, throw laterals if you want, all of that kind of good stuff. But for the same reason, you don't do the what does Scott Van Pelt call it? The pitchy woo. Yeah, the play at the end of the game where you're lateraling the ball just willy-nilly, pitchy witchy woo all over the pitch, if you will. Well, that doesn't make any sense at the end of the first half either, because obviously the other team could grab it, run it into the end zone, all that good stuff. That type of calculation needs to begin at the end of the half as well, because right now I think coaches are putting not only their teams in too much jeopardy, but the quarterbacks and their health specifically. We got to rethink this stuff, guys. For a bunch of conservative-minded people that generally does make up the college coaching community, I think they're getting a little bit risky and over their skis on this particular one. And finally, one note to go out on here, another Missouri note. Philip Roche had left the team during the season for Missouri, and now he is officially in the transfer portal as well. The defensive back for the Tigers never quite made it into the rotation. Seemed like that might happen at one point this fall, but obviously things did not work out for Philip Roche as he would have helped. So to the portal he goes. And no matter what happens here in the portal at the quarterback position, D-back, offensive line, and of course everything happening in the world of Mizzou basketball as well, I'm going to be here for you to cover it. Thanks for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou, making this show your first listen every day. And until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked On Mizzou.